The insult the throne room of Baron Varathkun stretched before Marcus Cole like a cathedral made of gold and cruelty. And the human commander stood alone in its center while dozens of alien eyes watched him with amusement. Skarathi were tall creatures, standing nearly 8 feet with scales that shimmered like precious metals. And their bodies were built for war, with claws that could tear through steel and teeth that could crush bone. And they looked down at the small human before them as if he were an insect that had wandered into their feast. Marcus had come to collect a debt. And the Baron knew it, and everyone in the room knew it. And that was precisely what made this moment so dangerous 3 weeks ago. Marcus and his crew of 42 humans had defended the Baron's mining colony from a pirate fleet. And they had been outgunned and outnumbered 12 ships to 3. And by every calculation, they should have died. But humans had a strange habit of not dying when the universe told them to. And when the smoke cleared, the pirates were scattered across the void, and the colony still stood. The Baron had promised payment. And the Skarathi noble's promise was binding under galactic law. And Marcus had traveled across 2 star systems to collect what he was owed. Baron Varathkun sat upon his throne of black stone, his scales embedded with rubies that caught the light with every breath. And his eyes were yellow with slitted pupils. And they held the kind of contempt that came from generations of looking down at lesser species. "You want payment, human?" the Baron asked, and his voice echoed through the chamber like thunder in a canyon. "I fulfilled my contract," Marcus replied. And his voice was calm and steady because he had learned long ago that aliens respected those who did not flinch. "Your colony stands because of my crew, and good soldiers died to make that happen." The Baron leaned forward on his throne, and a smile spread across his face that showed rows of needle-sharp teeth. And the courtiers around him began to whisper and chuckle as if sharing a private joke. "Very well," the Baron said. "I will give you something precious, something from my own bloodline, something that no human has ever received from a Skarathi noble." He raised one clawed hand and gestured to the guards at the side of the room, and they disappeared through a doorway. And the court fell silent with anticipation. Marcus felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up because he had been in enough dangerous situations to know when something was wrong. And the barely contained laughter of the courtiers told him that he was about to be the target of a joke. He did not yet understand the guards returned. And between them walked a figure that made the court erupt in cruel amusement. Skarathi. But she was unlike any Skarathi Marcus had ever seen. And where her people stood tall and proud, she was hunched and small, barely 6 feet tall. And where their scales gleamed with health and beauty, hers were dull and patchy with gaps that showed pale skin beneath. And one of her arms hung withered at her side, twisted and thin. Clearly useless, she kept her eyes fixed on the floor as she walked. And her good hand trembled at her side, and every step she took seemed to cost her something precious, some piece of dignity that she could not afford to lose. "I give you my daughter," the Baron announced, and his voice rang with mockery. "Siraval, 7th daughter of House Varathkun." The court exploded with laughter, and the sound bounced off the golden walls like weapons thrown at the small figure, who stood frozen in the center of the room. Marcus looked at her, and he saw the way she flinched at every laugh, the way her shoulders curved inward as if trying to make herself smaller, the way she had clearly spent her entire life trying to disappear. And something cold and hard formed in his chest. "She was injured as a child," the Baron continued, clearly enjoying himself. "A genetic treatment went wrong, and the damage could not be repaired, and she has been a burden on my house ever since. Useless for breeding, useless for combat, useless for politics, useless for anything at all." More laughter, louder now. And some of the courtiers were pointing at the girl and making comments in their own language that Marcus did not need to understand to know were cruel. "She is broken," the Baron said, and he spread his arms wide as if presenting a great treasure. A fitting reward for a human, yes? You saved my colony, so I give you my garbage. The girl still had not looked up, and Marcus realized that she was waiting for him to refuse her, waiting for the final humiliation of being rejected even as a joke. Waiting because that was what always happened. Marcus thought about his own world, about Earth and its history, about all the people who had been called broken and useless and worthless, about all the times humanity had been underestimated by these alien empires who measured value only in strength and perfection. He thought about his grandmother, who had lost her legs in an accident and had gone on to become one of the greatest engineers of her generation. And he thought about his brother, who had been born with a condition that the doctor said would limit him, and who now commanded a research station at the edge of known space. Humans did not throw away the broken. And that was something these aliens would never understand. I accept, Marcus said. The laughter stopped, and for a moment the throne room was silent. And then the laughter returned twice as loud, because they thought he did not understand the joke. They thought he was too stupid to realize he had been insulted. They thought humans were just that foolish, but Marcus understood perfectly. And as he walked towards Cyril and offered her his hand, he saw her look up for the first time. And her eyes were wide with confusion and fear and something else. Something that might have been hope if she still remembered what hope felt like. Come on, he said gently. Let me take you away from here. She took his hand, and her grip was weak and trembling. And as they walked out of the throne room together, the laughter followed them like a storm. The Baron watched them go, and he was still smiling, certain that he had delivered the greatest insult possible to the human who had dared to demand payment from him, had no idea that he had just made the worst mistake of his life. The human Waziravel sat in the corner of the small room. They had given her aboard the human ship and waited for the cruelty to begin. She had been waiting for 3 days now, and it had not come, and the waiting was almost worse than the cruelty itself, because at least cruelty was familiar, and she knew how to survive it. The ship was called the Defiant Hope, and it was small compared to Skarathi vessels, built for speed and cleverness rather than raw power. And everything about it was strange to her. From the soft lighting to the curved corridors to the way the humans spoke to each other with easy familiarity on the first day. A human woman with dark hair and kind eyes had come to her room and introduced herself as Dr. Chan. And she had asked if she could examine Cyril's arm. And Cyril had been so shocked by the request that she had simply nodded. Dr. Chan had spent an hour studying the withered limb, taking measurements and scans and asking questions about how it had happened and what treatments had been tried. And at the end, she had said something that made no sense at all. "We can work with this," she had said. And she had smiled as if this was good news Ziravel did not understand. And she spent that night lying awake trying to figure out what trick was being played on here. On the second day, Commander Cole had come to see her, and he had sat down in a chair across from her and asked her what she wanted for dinner. She had stared at him for a long moment, because no one had ever asked her that question before. And meals for her had always been whatever scraps were left after everyone else had eaten. And the idea that she might have a choice was so foreign that she did not know how to respond. "I do not know," she had finally said, and her voice was barely a whisper because she had learned long ago that speaking loudly only drew attention, and attention meant pain. "Well," he had said, "the cook makes a pretty good pasta, and we have some Valorian fruit that tastes like a mix between an apple and honey. I think there might be some leftover curry from yesterday if you like spicy food." She had chosen the pasta because it was the first thing he mentioned, and she was afraid that taking too long to decide would make him angry. But he had not been angry, and the pasta had been warm and filling, and she had eaten every bite. While he sat with her and talked about nothing important on the third day, she realized that they were not going to hurt her. And that realization was so overwhelming that she had retreated to her corner and tried to understand what was happening. The door chimed, and she flinched even though no one on this ship had given her reason to flinch. And then Commander Cole's voice came through the speaker. "Cyril, can I come in?" he asked, and she noticed that he asked rather than simply entering. And that small detail meant more to her than he would ever know. "Yes," she said. He entered and sat down in the same chair he had used before. And he looked at her with an expression she could not read. And then he spoke. "I want to show you something," he said. "But only if you want to see it." She nodded because she did not know what else to do. He led her through the ship. And as they walked, crew members nodded to her and some of them smiled. And one young man with red hair said, "Hey, you must be Cyril. Welcome aboard," as casually as if she were a normal person worthy of greeting. They arrived at a room filled with screens and consoles and holographic displays showing star maps and navigation routes. And Cyril felt her breath catch in her throat because she had dreamed of rooms like this her entire life. "This is the navigation center," Commander Cole said. "And my navigator tells me we could use some help." Cyril stared at the star maps, and her mind began to race with calculations and possibilities. And she saw patterns and routes that she had only imagined in her darkest and most secret moments. "I am not allowed," she whispered. "Navigation is forbidden for those of my status. You're not on your father's ship anymore," he said. "And on my ship, people do what they're good at. And Dr. Chun told me you have the spatial processing capabilities that our instruments can barely measure." She did not understand how he knew about her abilities. And then she remembered the scans that Dr. Chun had done. And she realized that the doctor had not just been examining her arm. "You tested me," she said. And there was no accusation in her voice because she was too confused to be angry. "I wanted to know what you could do," he said. "Because I had a feeling your father had no idea what he threw away." He gestured to the main console. And the navigator, a thin human man with gray hair, stepped aside and nodded encouragingly. "Show me what you can do." Commander Cole said. Cyril approached the console with trembling steps, and she looked at the star maps displayed before her. And for a moment she was frozen with fear, because what if she failed, and what if they sent her back, and what if this was all just another cruel joke? Then she began to work. Her good hand moved across the controls while her mind processed the data. And she saw the routes that the computer suggested, and she saw better routes. Faster routes, routes that cut through regions of space that others called impossible. And she began to input her calculations. The navigator watched with widening eyes, and Commander Cole leaned forward with interest. And after 20 minutes, Cyril stepped back and showed them what she had done. "This route through the shattered lanes," the navigator said slowly. "Our computer says it is impossible, but her math is perfect. And if we followed this path, we would cut our travel time by 60%. Commander Cole looked at the calculations, and then he looked at Cyril. And there was something in his eyes that she had never seen directed at her before. It was respect. "Your father had this," he said quietly, and he gave it away as a joke. Cyril did not know what to say, and she felt something wet on her face. And she realized she was crying for the first time in years on Earth. Commander Cole said, "We have a saying that what does not kill you makes you stronger. And we have another saying that the places where broken bones heal become the strongest parts. And we believe that no one is worthless, that everyone has something to offer. And that throwing away a person because they are different is the greatest waste imaginable." He put his hand on her shoulder, and the touch was gentle and warm, and nothing like the touches she had known before. "You're not broken," he said. "You were just surrounded by people too blind to see what you really are." For the first time in her life, Cyril felt something other than shame and fear. She felt hope. The forging 1 year had passed since Cyril had left her father's throne room, and she was no longer the same creature who had walked out with her eyes fixed on the floor. The change had not happened overnight. And there had been dark days when she woke up expecting cruelty and flinched at shadows that were not there. But the humans had been patient with her in a way that still amazed her doctor. Chen had built her a prosthetic frame for her withered arm. A beautiful piece of engineering that wrapped around the limb and gave it strength it had never possessed. And the first time Saravel had lifted a heavy crate with that arm, she had laughed out loud. And the sound had surprised her, because she had not laughed in so many years that she had forgotten she could. The crew of the Defiant Hope had adopted her as one of their own. And they taught her everything they knew, and she absorbed knowledge like a desert, absorbing Rain, the chief engineer. A large man named Rodriguez with hands scarred from years of work, taught her how the ship's engines functioned and how to repair them when they failed. And he told her stories about Earth and about a grandfather who had come from a country called Mexico and had built machines that still worked 50 years later. The weapons officer, a woman named Yuki with sharp eyes and a sharper mind, taught her tactical analysis and how to read a battle before it began. And she told Saravel that war was not about strength, but about thinking 3 moves ahead of your enemy. Dr. Chen became her first real friend, and they spent long evenings talking about everything and nothing, about science and medicine and philosophy and what it meant to be alive. And the doctor told her about a husband who had died young, and about how the grief had nearly destroyed her until she found purpose in helping others. And Commander Cole taught her how to lead. Leadership is not about giving orders, he told her one day as they stood on the bridge and watched the stars stream past. It is about making people want to follow you, and that means earning their trust and showing them that you care about them as much as you care about the mission. Saravel listened and learned, and slowly she began to change in ways that went deeper than any prosthetic could reach. She started to stand straighter, and her voice grew stronger, and she looked people in the eyes when she spoke to them instead of staring at the ground. And one day she realized that she had gone an entire week without flinching when someone approached her. Word began to spread through the sector about the human ship with the Skarathi navigator who could do the impossible. And they called her the Pathfinder because she found routes through spaces that no one else could navigate. And the Defiant Hope became famous for arriving where no one expected them. The Shattered Lanes were a region of space filled with unstable gravity wells and shifting asteroid fields and radiation storms that fried navigation computers. And every captain in the sector knew that trying to cross the lanes was suicide. But Saravel saw patterns in the chaos that others could not see, and she guided the ship through dangers that should have killed them all. They took contracts that no one else would take, and they saved ships that had been given up for lost. And they delivered cargo to colonies that had been cut off from supplies for months, and everywhere they went, people told stories about the small human ship and its impossible navigator. One night, Saravel sat in her quarters and looked at herself in the mirror, and she saw the dull patches on her scales and the places where her skin showed through. And she remembered how her father had called these marks proof of her worthlessness. An idea came to her, and she went to Rodriguez and asked for his help. 3 days later, she looked in the mirror again and saw something different, because now the gaps in her scales were filled with delicate circuits that glowed soft blue in the darkness, and the dull patches had been inlaid with tiny lights that traced patterns across her skin like constellations. She had turned her imperfections into art. And when she walked onto the bridge the next day, the crew stared at her with wonder instead of pity. "Beautiful," Dr. Chun said. And she meant it. Commander Cole smiled and nodded. And Saravel felt proud of herself for the first time in her life. The months continued to pass, and the Defiant Hope gathered others like itself, outcasts and exiles from a dozen species who had been thrown away by their people. And Saravel trained them just as she had been trained, and she showed them that their differences were not weaknesses, but strengths waiting to be discovered. There was Crix, a Valorian who had been born without the telepathic abilities that his species valued above all else. And he turned out to be the finest pilot Cyril had ever seen because his mind was not distracted by the mental noise that plagued his people. There was Myra, a Thenoshi whose shell had grown wrong and left her smaller than the rest of her kind. And she became their best infiltration specialist because she could fit through spaces that no other Thenoshi could reach. There was Jorth, a massive creature from a species whose name translated to the Strong Ones, who had been exiled because he preferred building things to breaking them. And he became their chief of repairs and kept their growing fleet running with nothing but spare parts and determination. They were the broken ones, the discarded ones, the ones their worlds had thrown away. And together they became something powerful, and at their head stood Saravel, who had once been a joke given to a human, and who was now becoming something her father could never have imagined. The universe had tried to destroy her, and it had failed, and now she was ready to show the universe exactly what she could do. The legend 10 years had passed since the day Saravel returned to her father's palace, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Skarathi Reformation, they called it, a revolution that had started with one broken daughter and spread across entire civilization. And now Skarathi children who were born different were not hidden away in shame but celebrated for what they could become. Cyril stood at the window of her office aboard the massive station called Unity, and she looked out at the stars that had once seemed so far away. And she remembered the girl she had been, the girl who had spent her life staring at the floor and waiting for pain. That girl was gone, and in her place stood Fleet Admiral Cyril of the Allied Systems, the first Skarathi to hold such a rank, the first of any species outside the founding races to command the combined military forces of 32 worlds. Her navigation techniques were taught in academies across the sector, and her routes through the shattered lanes had opened up trade and travel that had transformed entire economies. And ships flew paths that she had calculated and saved weeks of travel time on every journey. But more important than any of that was what she had become to the people who had once been thrown away. They came to her from every corner of the galaxy, the broken ones and the discarded ones and the ones their worlds had called worthless. And she welcomed them all, and she showed them what the humans had shown her, that every being had value, that every difference could become a strength, that the universe did not get to decide what they were worth. The door to her office opened, and Commander Marcus Cole walked in, older now with gray in his hair, but with the same kind eyes that had looked at her with respect when everyone else had looked at her with contempt. "The ceremony is about to start," he said. "They are waiting for you." Cyril smiled and nodded, and she walked with him through the corridors of the station, and everywhere she went people stopped and saluted and looked at her with admiration in their eyes. The ceremony was for the unveiling of a new monument, a statue that would stand in the central plaza of Unity Station for generations to come. And Cyril had tried to refuse the honor, but the council had insisted. They arrived at the plaza, and thousands of beings from dozens of species filled the space. And they cheered when they saw her, and she felt the warmth of their love and respect wash over her like sunlight. She climbed the steps to the platform where the covered statue waited, and she looked out at the crowd, and she saw faces that had become familiar over the years. Crix the pilot and Mira, the infiltrator, and Jorth, the builder, and so many others who had found their purpose in her fleet. Dr. Chun sat in the front row, older now but still with that same kind smile, and beside her sat the children she had adopted. A human and a Skarathi and a Valorian, 3 species united in one family. Cyril took a deep breath and began to speak. "When I was young," she said, and her voice carried across the plaza through speakers that broadcast her words to every corner of the station. "I was told that I was worthless, and I believed it. And I spent years waiting to die, because I thought that was all I deserved." The crowd was silent, listening. "Then a human came into my life," she continued, "and he looked at me and saw something that no one else had ever seen. And he gave me a chance to become more than my father's shame. She looked at Commander Cole, who stood at the edge of the platform with tears in his eyes. The humans taught me that broken does not mean worthless. She said, they taught me that. The places where we heal become the strongest parts of us. And they taught me that every being in this universe has something precious to offer if only someone will take the time to see it. She reached for the cord that would unveil the statue, and she paused. This statue is not a monument to me, she said. It is a monument to everyone who was ever told they were not good enough. And it is a promise that we will never stop fighting for a galaxy where no one is thrown away. She pulled the cord, and the covering fell away, and the crowd gasped. The statue showed two figures. A tall Skarathi woman with lights glowing in her scales, and a human man in a commander's coat. And they stood side by side as equals, looking out at the stars with hope in their eyes, and at the base of the statue were words in 12 languages that all said the same thing. What could this become? The crowd erupted in cheers, and Cyril felt tears running down her face, and she did not try to hide them because she had learned that tears were not weakness. They were proof that you still had the courage to feel later that night. She sat with Commander Cole on a balcony overlooking the plaza, and they watched the lights of the station twinkle like earthbound stars, and they did not need to speak because they had said everything that needed to be said long ago. But finally Cole broke the silence. Your father sent a message today, he said. He wants to come to the station. He wants to see you. Cyril thought about the creature who had given her away as a joke, who had called her garbage, who had tried to have her killed, and she searched her heart for anger and found only peace. Let him come, she said. Let him see what his joke became. Cole smiled and nodded, and they sat together in comfortable silence across the galaxy, in academies and homes and ships traveling through the endless dark. People told the story of the broken daughter who became a legend, and the lesson was always the same. The universe had looked at humanity and seen soft creatures from a tiny world, creatures without claws or scales or natural armor, and the universe had laughed at them just as Baron Vareth Kuhn had laughed at his worthless daughter. But humans did not accept that broken meant worthless, and they did not believe that different meant lesser, and they looked at what the universe threw away and asked a question that changed everything. What could this become? Baron Vareth Kuhn had given Marcus Cole his broken daughter as a joke. The human had returned her as a legend, and the galaxy would never forget the lesson she taught them. That the true measure of a civilization was not how it treated the strong and the perfect, but how it treated the weak, and the broken humanity had shown them a better way, and the broken ones had risen to lead them all into a brighter future. The return 2 years after she had been given away as a joke, Cyril received a message that changed everything. Baron Vareth Kuhn was dying not from illness or age, but from war, because a rival noble house called the Draketh had surrounded his systems with a fleet of 200 ships and cut off all supply lines. And his own fleet had been shattered in 3 brutal battles, and his allies had abandoned him because no one wanted to stand beside a losing side. The blockade was perfect, and there was no way for reinforcements to reach him, and the only possible route was through the shattered lanes. And everyone knew that the shattered lanes were impossible to navigate. Everyone, except Siravelshi, stood on the bridge of her flagship, a vessel she had named the Second Chance, and she looked at the star map that showed her father's desperate situation, and she felt the eyes of her crew watching her and waiting to see what she would do. Commander Cole stood beside her, no longer her master, but her advisor and friend, and the closest thing to a father she had ever known. And he said nothing because he knew this decision had to be hers. He threw me away, Cyril said quietly, and her voice was steady even though her hearts were pounding in her chest. He called me garbage and gave me to a stranger as an insult. He did. Cole agreed. He tried to have me killed twice before I was old enough to be protected by tradition. I know, Part of me wants to let him die, she admitted. And the words hurt to say, because she had spent 2 years learning to be better than the cruelty. She had known. Cole nodded slowly and looked at the star map. And then he looked at her, and his eyes held no judgment. What does the other part want? He asked. Cyril thought about the question. And she thought about everything the humans had taught her. And she thought about the person she wanted to be. The other part wants to show him what I have become, she said. And the other part wants to prove that mercy is not weakness. Cole smiled. And it was the proud smile of a teacher watching a student surpass them. Then let us go save your father, he said. The fleet moved out within the hour. 23 ships crewed by the outcasts and exiles of a dozen worlds. And Cyril stood at the navigation console and began her calculations. The shattered lanes were chaos given form. And the gravity wells shifted like living things. And the radiation storms could fry a ship's systems in seconds. And no computer in the galaxy could plot a safe course through their depths. But Cyril was not a computer. She was something better. She saw the patterns that others could not see. And her mind processed the chaos and found order hidden within it. And she called out course corrections faster than the helmsman could enter them. And the fleet followed her voice through the impossible darkness. Ships that should have been crushed by gravity emerged unharmed. And vessels that should have been lost in the storms flew true. And for 18 hours, Cyril did not sleep, and did not rest, and did not falter. They emerged from the shattered lanes like ghosts appearing from nowhere. And the Dracoth blockade had no warning and no time to react. And suddenly the impossible had happened, and Baron Vareth Kun had reinforcements. The battle was brutal but brief, because the Dracoth had positioned their fleet to maintain a blockade, and not to fight a war on 2 fronts. And Cyril's outcasts fought with the ferocity of those who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove when it was over. The Dracoth fleet was scattered and fleeing, and the blockade was broken. And Cyril took a shuttle down to her father's palace with Commander Cole at her side. The throne room was the same as she remembered. Gold and cruel and filled with courtiers. But the courtiers were not laughing now. And the Baron was not smiling on his throne. He looked old, she realized, old and tired and beaten. And when she walked into the room, he rose to his feet and stared at her as if seeing a ghost. Daughter, he breathed. And there was no mockery in his voice this time. Only shock and something that might have been fear. Cyril walked forward until she stood in the center of the room where she had stood 2 years ago. But everything was different now, because she was not hunched and trembling. She was tall and proud and glowing with the light she had chosen for herself. You gave me away as an insult, she said. And her voice rang through the chamber like a bell. You called me broken and worthless and garbage. The Baron said nothing because there was nothing he could say. The human received me as a gift, she continued. And he saw what you were too blind to see. And he gave me something you never did. What? Her father asked. A chance, she said. She stepped closer to the throne. And the guards moved to stop her, but a gesture from the Baron made them stand aside. And she looked up at the creature who had made her childhood a nightmare. I could destroy you, she said. I could take your throne and your title and everything you have. And no one in this room would stop me. The Baron's yellow eyes were wide. And she saw understanding dawn in them as he realized that she was right. That the power had shifted, that the joke he had made had turned into something that could end him. But I am not going to do that, Cyril said, because the human taught me something you never understood. She reached into her coat and pulled out a datapad. And she handed it to her father, and he looked at the contents with confusion. These are my terms, she said. Alliance between my fleet and your house. Reformation of the succession laws to protect those born different. Rights and dignity for all Skarathi, regardless of their physical form. Why? Her father asked, and his voice was small. Why would you show me mercy after everything I did to you? Cyril looked at Commander Cole, who stood at the edge of the room with a small smile on his face. And she felt gratitude so deep it almost hurt, because mercy is not weakness, she said. Turning back to her father, "It is the privilege of the strong. And I am strong now, stronger than you ever were. And I choose to build instead of destroy." The Baron looked at the datapad, and then he looked at his daughter. And for the first time in her life, she saw something in his eyes that she had never expected to see: respect. "I accept your terms," he said quietly. Cyril nodded and turned to leave. And as she walked out of the throne room with Commander Cole at her side, she heard something she had never heard before: applause. The courtiers who had laughed at her 2 years ago were applauding now. And the sound followed her out of the palace and into the light of a new day.